All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is Chapter 17, Freedom's Boundaries at Home and Abroad. And this is the last decade of the 19th century and one of the most important decades in American history. So we're going to start talking about the farmers and the populist challenge. Farmers in the South and the West saw their prices falling and they became dependent on merchants and banks. But the policies in place with the government were not conducive for farmers to succeed. The money supply had been reduced, farm prices were higher, depending upon the railroad, and bank loans with high interest rates. All was bad news for the farmers. So they're going to unite. We're going to see the People's Party, known as the Populists. And not only did they appeal to farmers, but they tried to get the votes from the miners and the workers. But most of the support came from the cotton and wheat farmers. And the populists were forward thinking. They utilized modern technologies. They asked the government to control certain industries. A lot of their ideals will be later on incorporated into the country, such as direct election of the Senate. That will become the 17th Amendment. Income tax, a progressive income tax, became the 16th Amendment. National ownership of railroad, women's suffrage. All of these are going to be their ideals. So they're going to try to unite the black and white farmers in the South. However, the Democrats were able to mobilize the whites and try to warn them to stick with the Democratic Party so that they can control the blacks in the region. In the 1892 election, James Weaver, the populist candidate, had a great showing despite the party's young age. They received 1 million votes, won 5 states, some members to Congress, some governors. However, the populist movement will be short-lived. Here's the election of 1892 with Weaver, and Grover Cleveland was victorious over Benjamin Harrison. Not only were farmers having troubles in the 1890s, but of course laborers as well. 1893 saw a horrific depression. The last 3 decades all battled with terrible depressions. And employers were using the federal government to put down any fighting. 1894, Coxey's Army, which was a march of the unemployed, trying to show their disgust with the situation. They were broken up by the federal government. The Pullman strike, in which Eugene Debs, the leader of the union, is going to be eventually jailed for not listening to the court-ordered injunction ordering the strikers back to work, and that's going to be the end of that strike and another defeat for the workers. In prison, Debs will become a socialist. We'll talk about him again in World War I. There's an image of Coxey's Army back in 1894, and Andrew Carnegie's Ironworks at Homestead was the site of a terrible strike and battle between workers and strike breakers. Shoot. So populism and labor. Populist demands did not meet the workers' needs, and unfortunately, for the populists, the vote was not able to be garnered. Most of the people working in the cities are going to stick with the Republican Party. So in 1896, William Jennings Bryan, on the campaign of Free Silver, is going to earn the Democratic nomination and bring the populist vote with him. And Bryan was a big advocate of adding silver to the economy. Very famous quote, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Great orator, youngest presidential candidate in history at the age of 36. Also a 3-time loser in his campaigns for the presidency, 96, 1900, and 1908. So McKinley is going to become victorious. He's going to carry the industrial states in the Northeast and the Midwest. There's an image of William Jennings Bryan carrying the cross of gold. On to segregation, and those that regained power after Reconstruction were known as the Redeemers, who are supposedly saving the South from black rule. They're going to reverse Reconstruction's achievements. So all of those gains made during the Reconstruction period will be for naught. They're going to utilize black prison convicts and essentially enslave them, renting them out to railroad companies, miners, things like that. Here's some pictures of Florida convicted laborers, and the charges were just petty and trumped up just to make them, a way of getting their labor. So for blacks in the South, black men were excluded from skilled and professional occupations. Women were limited to wage work as domestic servants. So the opportunities to rise up and to be successful were extremely limited. As a result, many blacks moved out of the South. 1879 to 1880, 60,000 moved to Kansas seeking new opportunities. However, most blacks had no choice but to stay in the South. So we're going to see a huge decline in black politics. So all of the gains that they made electing officials to office, by the end of the century, that's going to virtually come to an end. And with the poll tax and the literacy tests and the grandfather clauses, there were many ways to stop blacks from voting. And of course, the Ku Klux Klan and lynching. So there were violent means as well. And essentially, voting will be eliminated, despite the 15th Amendment, which said otherwise. By 1940, only 3% of blacks were registered to vote. And in 1891, the Senate defeated a proposal to protect Southern black voting rights. So that includes Northerners as well that are part of that. And the Supreme Court will approve laws that took away voting rights. So this was not just a Southern thing, this was nationwide. The law of segregation, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which outlawed racial discrimination in public facilities, is going to be struck down by the Supreme Court in 1883, setting the stage for one of the most famous or infamous Supreme Court cases in history, Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. And that's the famous, it's okay to segregate as long as the facilities are separate but equal. But as we know, they were anything but equal. And segregation is going to ensure that whites will always have an advantage over blacks in every aspect of life throughout the South. So here's an image of an African American colored sign there, water fountain. And African Americans of all ages were required to abide by these segregation laws with swift penalties if they didn't. Huge rise of lynching. It's going to peak in the 1890s, and in this time period, as stated in the slide, more than 50 lynchings occurred each year, and in total, close to 5,000 lynchings throughout the South and the North as well. So these atrocities were often committed against victims who were, most 99% of the cases, if not higher, falsely accused of a crime. And the politics of memory, as the 1890s come to a close, people begin remembering the Civil War as this tragic quarrel between brothers, between white people that are fighting. It was not about African Americans, not about slavery. And then Reconstruction will be viewed as a period of black misrule, forced on by the North. And this was kind of an excuse to legitimize segregation in the South by those redeemers. There's a crowd of 10,000 people watching the lynching of Henry Smith. And here are some lynching statistics, which are just mind-boggling to me. Immigration. So immigrants were seen as a threat to Americans' sense of identity and traditions. And 3.5 million Eastern European immigrants, these were known as the new immigrants, were flowing into the country. So the old immigrants were from Germany and France and England and Western Europe. But these new immigrants were from Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many were Jews, and they were seen as less civilized. And of course, a lot of attention was drawn on the Chinese. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 will bar them from entering the country. And Chinese that were already here suffered intense discrimination and mob violence. Back to African Americans, a leader will emerge, Booker T. Washington, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois, who we'll talk about a little bit later. And Washington emphasized that the African Americans help themselves within their community, and try to abandon politics, abandon their fight for equality and civil rights, So he's going to urge blacks to accept segregation, and he believed that if they could obtain farming and skills that could help them in the workplace, that is most important at the time, and then eventually they can get the rights that they were entitled to. Of course, Du Bois will have a differing opinion, which we'll talk about later. Here's a picture of Booker T. Washington. So while this was happening at home, abroad, the United States is going to embark in imperialism. While in the second half of the 1800s, most of Africa and Asia were carved up by the European powers, the United States will enter the foray in 1898. And the justification for many of these countries, these backwards people, so-called, needed civilization in their lives. And they needed Western values and government and Christianity and labor practices. And this coincides with the social Darwinism theory and manifest destiny. And it goes on and on. So for the first time in American history, they will expand outside the continental United States. All right, so they are going to be lured in by this desire for empire, and part of the influence stemmed from Alfred Mahan's book, which the idea was no nation can prosper without a large merchant fleet and a navy, and the United States will have those things in place. In 1893, the United States American planters attempted to take Hawaii. They organized a rebellion to overthrow the Queen. President Harrison asked for annexation. President Cleveland is going to withdraw that request. By 1898, America is going to break out into a war with Spain, and a lot of this stemmed from the issues in Cuba, which is only 90 miles away from Florida, where Cubans were revolting against Spanish rule. The Spanish used brutal methods to suppress the Cubans, including concentration camps to round up the civilians. Many Americans were horrified at it. The press talked about it often in the newspapers. American businesses were involved in Cuba, so the United States sent the battleship Maine down to Cuba to keep an eye on things. An explosion occurred when a fire broke out in the explosives section of the boat. 270 Americans were killed. Of course, who was blamed? Spain. And in this quick little war, which was named the Splendid Little War, the United States will emerge victorious and acquire Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. All of those were taken from the Spanish, who controlled them since the 1500s. Teddy Roosevelt became a nationwide hero at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Him and his Rough Riders. Eventually Roosevelt will become governor of New York later that fall. A couple of years later, McKinley's vice president. And then when McKinley was assassinated in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt became the youngest president in history. Here's the charge of the Rough Riders, no DMX though, at San Juan Hill. And ironically, African Americans actually made it up the hill first, but Roosevelt didn't acknowledge that and took credit for it. Here is an image of the war in the Pacific, where Admiral Dewey is going to defeat the Spanish in the Philippines, and actually worked with the Philippine president, Emilio Aguinaldo. So the Filipinos and the Americans teamed up. The Americans actually promised the Filipinos their independence, and then they backstabbed them. And the Americans made a deal with the Spanish. They did a fake little battle where the Spanish are going to surrender to the Americans, and the Americans will take control to the dismay of the Filipinos. Here's an image of the war over in the Caribbean with Puerto Rico and Cuba. So America had itself a little empire. McKinley was unwilling to grant Cubans and Filipinos their independence. He believed they were incapable of self-rule. And Hawaii is going to be taken after the Spanish-American War, and that was the perfect coaling station on the way to the Philippines, which is on your way to China and the rest of Asia. The Platt Amendment, named after Maloney's rival Orville Platt, gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba with their military. Cubans felt betrayed by this. And as we said before, with the Philippines, the Filipinos are not going to just lie down and let the Americans take over their country.